Boris Johnson said he would find it very difficult to vote for Rishi Sunak's new Brexit deal. The former Prime Minister claims that the deal is not about taking back control, while backing for the new Prime Minister's deal, the WINDSOR Framework, remains uncertain. Many are concerned over the King's meeting with the European Union's Ursula von der Leyen, deeming it to have been something of a political trap. Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by a good friend of mine and of this programme, and that's Rafe Heydel-Mankoo. Rafe is a Royal Broadcaster and commentator and no mean historian and constitutionalist himself. Oh, very, very good to see you. This clearly mattered enormously to Ursula. The location, the imagery, I hate the word optics, but in this case it's spot on. She, as the President of the European Union Commission, desperately wanted to be seen, as it were, on a par with the King, who is a head of state. She is not head of state, even if there are those within the European area who'd love the EU to become ultimately a superstate. She isn't that yet, but she wanted to be seen rubbing shoulders with King Charles.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the key issue here is timing. We know that the monarchy is, the heavy artillery in our arsenal when it comes to our soft power status, and von der Leyen is a self-declared Anglophile. And as you say, even though she's not a head of state, there's nothing at all wrong with meeting an international leader, be it her or the Secretary General of the United Nations. But for the King to actually meet with the head of Britain's opposing side, when the ink on this Windsor Framework isn't even dry, the details haven't been combed over with a fine-tooth comb by all of the parties, and its implications haven't been considered by all of the relevant and interested parties in this, that's where the problem here really lies, because, it's the cardinal rule of constitutional monarchy that the sovereign never gets involved in political matters until they have been agreed and finalised. So in Parliament, you never have the sovereign involve themselves in political legislation until it's received Parliament's approval, and then they give their royal assent. And so by being seen so closely involved with this at this stage, it's really, you can only take it as the King's endorsement of this framework. And I think that's very unwise when there are significant voices amongst Brexiteers, both here and, of course, in Northern Ireland too, who are uneasy about all of this. And, it's not just the meeting, though, between the King and von der Leyen. It's also the very name of this. It's the Windsor Framework, which, I think deliberately by the government associates the monarchy, the most iconic name and symbol of the monarchy, with this deal. And so why did they do that? Well, I think this was deliberately done because, unionists in Northern Ireland and in Britain are both concerned about the future of the Union. And by so closely linking this now through the meeting and through the name of the framework to the monarchy and to the King, it's almost as if the government is daring them to vote it down. This is a test of their loyalty to the Crown and to the Union. And I think that's a deeply dishonourable tactic by the government. And we can only hope and pray that this deal doesn't go seriously awry, because the King will then have been placed in a very awkward position.
So he wouldn't have done it had it not been the wish of Downing Street and the Foreign Office. We know that, and you made the crucial point about the nature of the constitutional monarchy. Therefore, should he have said, no, I don't think I should be doing that?
Well, yes. I mean, there is a broader issue here, and it's that there seems to have been some, over the last few decades, I should say, a loss of institutional memory within the royal household. Traditionally, courtiers and members of the royal household were almost born to the role. They were fully drenched in the crown and the constitution. But in recent years, we've seen a lot of important offices in the palace being occupied by very talented people who've come from the private sector or who've come from other government departments and perhaps aren't quite as savvy on the importance of of the Constitution and the monarchy. The Queen set a very good precedent here. We saw in 2019 how she didn't really want to get involved at all in being seen to prorogue Parliament. I think a lesson will have been learnt by the King and his courtiers after this. We know that only 8% of the public actually think this is a big deal, which is good on one side. But at the same time, I think lessons that certainly have to have been learned from this. I was trying to think, of the best historical precedent from this, and there's quite an extreme one, but the only thing I can think of is when King George VI invited Neville Chamberlain onto the balcony of Buckingham Palace, the first politician there, in 1938, when he came back from Munich with this infamous Munich Agreement, Peace in Our Time, which gave the Germans the Sudetenland. And then, of course, at that time, like now with the WINDSOR Framework, most people were in favour of it, but there was strong opposition in Parliament then, as now, then led by Winston Churchill. And a few months after being seen with Chamberlain, with Peace in Our Time, Britain found itself at war, and the King had a very, very awkward moment there, an embarrassing moment, particularly as the new Prime Minister was Winston Churchill, who had opposed so much Chamberlain's appeasement. And that's, I think, one of the issues we have to always remember. Wait until things are done and settled. It's never advisable for the sovereign to get involved in anything until it's a done deal.
I totally agree with you. Final observation, and I was chatting to an old mate of mine who's a very senior Tory, goes way back to the Thatcher days the other evening, and we were chatting about the fact that many people feel this generation of political leaders is not the creme de la creme. But he said, actually, this generation of advisors is not the creme de la creme either. Either those senior civil servants who advise ministers, or, as you've just eloquently said yourself, perhaps some of the senior advisors who advise in Buckingham Palace. They do matter, and they have real influence and power.
It's a serious issue. One of the problems that you had when America went into Iraq and Afghanistan were how few people there were in the American civil service who were experts on the Middle East and who could speak the languages, compared to when Britain had its empire and the Foreign Office was filled with people who were genuinely passionate about these subject areas. There was a time when we actually understood the need to have expertise within all of these departments. A lot of that's been lost. You can blame our education system actually for much of this, because of course they failed to teach the essentials of civics. You do have some think tanks which exist to try to provide training to civil servants, but I think it's the very peripatetic nature of life within government departments and the civil service now, where people just move along every few months or every few years to a new department, and we've lost this institutional memory, and that's, I think, the core of this issue.
Well, I think that's a theme we may return to on this programme, and thank you for sharing your initial thoughts. Yes, that was a booking for you next time as well. Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, good friend of mine, brilliant constitutionalist, historian and royal commentator. Have a great weekend, Rafe. Thank you very much indeed.